Hello, welcome everyone. I'm so glad to see all of your names today. I'm so glad you guys are here for the Metro Council Mental Health KC webinar. Um, welcome. Glad you guys could be here. And so before we begin, just wanted to let you guys know a few things. So we're on Zoom webinars. We utilize Zoom webinars so that we can have as many people as possible join our webinars, and we're not hopefully then limited. Um, but with Zoom webinar, you are only able to see the presenter and myself because we're hosting, but not yourself. So you'll be able to communicate through Q&A and through chat. And then also at the end, certificate of attendance is going to be available. We'll put the link in there in the chat so that way you can get it. So with that, I want to introduce myself. So uh, I'm Jamie. I'm with Metro Council. And Metro Council, just to let all of you know, just a little bit about us and what we are. We are a collaboration of community mental health centers across the whole Kansas City area. So we represent public mental health system of community behavioral health centers across the whole metro. And so we include the following organizations. So University Health, Behavioral Health, Beacon Mental Health, Rediscover Mental Health, Comprehensive Mental Health, Swope Health, Johnson County Mental Health Center, Wyandotte Behavioral Network, Center for Behavioral Medicine, and Mental Health America of the Heartland. So there are many of us, we all come together to do things like education, information, resources to the public. And we host the Mental Health KC conference every May, along with free webinars on the second and fourth Thursday of every month. So please save the date for our 2025 Mental Health KC conference. It's occurring May 29th and 30th at Johnson County Community College. We actually just closed our call for presentations, but we would love to have you attend our conference. So if you have any questions about it, let us know, but save the date, May 29th, 30th. And so excited to introduce Andrea. Andrea is actually part of our committee. Oh, and I should also say, just as a reminder, the views and opinions presented are those of the speaker and do not necessarily represent the opinions of Metro Council. But as I said, Andrea is part of our committee. Really excited to have her speak today on becoming trauma-informed, responding to trauma and building resilience. Just a little bit about Andrea before she starts, but she's worked for nearly 12 years as a board-certified music therapist, primarily in inpatient mental health units in the Kansas City area. And she took on the unique opportunity as a trauma-informed care consultant in 2016. Building on her underlying fascination with the way that the brain works, a critical appreciation for research, and a creative spirit and strong commitment to make the world a better place for all people. And she's currently the director of the Center for Trauma-Informed Innovation at University Health, developing trauma-informed, culturally responsive programs, practices, and policies. And so with that, I am so excited to introduce Andrea.
Thanks, Jamie. I was muted that whole thing that I was just saying. I'm a real person. Also, maybe that should be in my in my bio. Try to try to do things, and they don't always work the way you think they are. Well, it's nice to be with you all today, and I hope that despite our webinar format, I want this to be interactive. So please do put things in the chat. I have a few prompts along the way that I'd love to get your input on, responses to. So just want to put that out there. And if that's not the place you're in today, that's fine too. But, sit back, just take it in, listen. I will say that we're going to be talking about trauma a little bit. And as a result, that may activate your stress response. I'm not going to say or do anything intentionally to do that to you, I hope. Well, I certainly won't do it intentionally. It can happen though. So I want to just encourage you to do what you need to do to take care of yourself should you find that your stress response is activated by anything that we discussed today. That might mean that you need to walk away for a little bit, or it may just be that you need to look away from the screen or close your eyes for a second, take a breath. It may be that you need to come back and watch the video later. All of those are fine options. Again, reach out also for help if you do need anything. I'll give you my email at the end. You can also contact a emergency or crisis response program if that's something that I hope that doesn't happen today for you, but that is a very valuable resource that we have in our community. And you can access those crisis response resources by dialing 988. Very simple these days. And I'm learning more and more how many people don't realize that we've changed over, that our crisis lines now are all 988. So spread that word around if that's not familiar in your community. Before we dive in, I want to just invite you to pause. You've probably been running around. I was telling Jamie before we got started today that my calendar has been kind of nutty this week. Maybe it's because of the holiday on Monday. Maybe it's just because I just like it's the beginning of the year. I don't know. There's a lot of things on my mind, and I'm sure some of you can relate to that. So I want us to just pause for a moment and take a breath. And if you need to close your eyes and take another breath, that is just fine too. And just bring your attention to the current moment. Check in with yourself. Just notice, do you need to move around a little? Are you settled pretty well? Do you feel unsettled? Is there anything you can do right now that would help you feel a little more ease? And then just ask yourself, what is most important right now? And of course, I hope that that's engaging in this webinar today. And if it's not, that's okay. Go do what you need to do. This is recorded, so you can come back to it later, which is a really great benefit. And thank you, Metro Council, for making that happen. Okay. So this today is going to be really just a high level, brief overview of trauma-informed care. Some of you are probably really familiar with trauma-informed care. Some of you may not be familiar with it at all. All are welcome. I think what we do in the Center for Trauma-Informed Innovation is try to take the concepts of trauma-informed care and make them very practical and actionable. So that's mostly what I'm going to focus on today, is that idea of becoming trauma-informed. I always like to point out to people that it's not just like a box you can check off. You can't just go to a class and you're magically trauma informed. It's really an ongoing process, because the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. And that opens up even more opportunity and possibility. Yeah, I think that's all I'm going to say right now. I noticed in the chat, someone asked if you get access to the slides, and here you go. Yes, I have slides and handouts, some additional resources for you in that handout packet. So you can access that at the QR code or by typing that link into your browser. I'm going to leave that up there for just a moment because if you miss it now, just know that it's being recorded. And so you can go back later when it shows up on our YouTube channel and get to that again. I will also flash it up at the end so you can get it. All right. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and move on. Thanks for your reactions. I love that too. Please, throughout, react, type in the chat. I would love to have interaction. It's weird to me. I'm an extrovert, so it's a little weird to me to be talking like what feels like into the void just a bit. So I appreciate those interactions. All right. So what does it mean to become trauma informed or to be trauma informed? We in the Center for Trauma Informed Innovation have adopted and then adapted the concepts of the 4 R's from SAMHSA. The National Council for Mental Wellbeing also came out with a complementary collection of 4 things. I believe they all used eyes. We loved them both and wanted to kind of combine them in a way. So we've got these ideas around what it means to be trauma informed, or these action items. And we really practice trauma informed caring. It's an action. It's not just a thing, it is an action. So I love to say trauma informed caring, and we have started using that language a lot in our work. In fact, our podcast is called Trauma Informed Caring. But we practice that in order to protect relationships, protect the environments that we're in, protect our workplaces, our homes, and the people that are in all of those systems that we encounter. We really strive to practice trauma-informed caring in a way that fosters resilience in individuals and systems for the good of all people. Every person is valuable. Every person has something to contribute, and every person ought to be able to have the opportunity to give that contribution. So that's something that is really a fundamental belief of mine personally, as well as a value of our department. So to be trauma informed is to recognize the prevalence, signs, and impacts of trauma, to then take that and infuse that knowledge into our policies, our procedures, our practices. And I always like to pause here to say that we all have policies, even if we don't have a policy manual in every aspect of our lives. We have policies. We have personal policies around our boundaries, the things that we do with regularity in our lives, the practices that we've taken on. So it's not only about our organizations, it's also about us personally. And then we actively resist re-traumatization in as many ways as we can. That doesn't mean that we avoid talking about difficult subjects. That doesn't mean that we try to just keep everything peaceful all the time. What that means is that we respond to events as they're happening, even internal events as they're happening, in a way that fosters, actually, it's the next one, that fosters restoration, well-being, and growth. And really being able to be responsive, I think, is an important piece of becoming trauma informed. It's not just that we know this stuff, it's how we put it into action. And also not just in our workplaces. Many of you I know are clinicians. This is not just a clinical thing. Being trauma-informed, practicing trauma-informed caring is something all of us can do everywhere, in every aspect of our lives. And in fact, I would argue that the most successful people at being trauma-informed are doing it in every aspect of their life, because it really is a mindset shift. It takes over how you see other people and how you respond to them. So that's a really key piece of it. And another key piece of it that I want to point out is that it's not just about all those other people that are in your lives. It's also about you and how you take care of yourself and how you respond to the trauma or the stress that you're experiencing. So I'm going to touch on all of those things a little bit today. I'm going to start with recognizing the prevalence, signs, and impacts of trauma, and then we'll get to the other 3 points, kind of the second half of what we'll talk about today. So everything really starts with the brain and our kind of human stress response, and what's going on in our brains when we're not in our stress response. Understanding what processes are taking place and how our brains are wired in different ways is really foundational to understanding the prevalence, signs, and impacts of trauma. So I'm going to start here with the brain. This is quite simplified. So if any of you are neuroscientists, I apologize, because you may you may know a whole lot more about this than what I'm going to unpack today. We have adopted using the kind of 3 brain states model. Now, this is not a perfect model. Our brains are very complex, and there's a lot going on in there. What I like about the brain states model is that there is the recognition that our executive functions and our stress response have a really important dynamic, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But I want to give you just a little information about what these different 3 states of the brain are. So the first is the executive state. That primarily, that when that is active, there's a lot of activity going on in the prefrontal lobes, which is just kind of right behind your forehead, like the very front part of your brain. Um, the executive functions are essential to being human. We have things like our self-control, which includes our emotional regulation, our behavior inhibition, our ability to motivate ourselves or to initiate action, our ability to tolerate stress, and also things like time management, willpower. And then we also have working memory that really activates a lot of that part of our brain too. Both are verbal and nonverbal working memory. So our ability to focus our attention, to comprehend both simple and complex instructions, tasks, processes, our ability to reason, retrieve memories, planning, prioritizing, organizing, decision making, all of those things that probably make you a good employee, right? But also really help us be able to accomplish our goals in the world. And then another really important executive function that I want to highlight is our mental flexibility. And mental flexibility relies on our self-awareness. It relies on our ability to see ourselves in a context and observe our own thinking. So sometimes we call that metacognition, thinking about our thinking. That ability to observe ourselves is really important when we get into challenging situations. And as I'll unpack in just a moment, we sometimes lose access to that. Mental flexibility is also related to our ability to practice acceptance in the present moment. Being able to say, like, this is how it is right now, but that's not necessarily how it will always be. It's being able to live in that kind of gray area that most of life is. So those executive functions are really important, as I hope you see. The thing that happens when we encounter a stressor, especially if it's a stressor that is a threat to our physical or our emotional well-being, is that we have heightened activity in the lower part of our brain. So some of you might be familiar with the stress response, the fight, flight, or freeze response. That's where this is happening. It's in the brainstem. And our survival state is mostly concerned with safety, especially physical safety. Like, am I going to make it through this thing alive? So because that is such a fundamental part of our existence, is like, am I going to make it through this alive? The brain actually has a kind of an override mechanism that shuts down most of the rest of our functioning, except for those very basic tasks that are going to get us to safety, whatever that looks like, whether we're running away or we're fighting something off or we're shutting down, going into that freeze response. Human brains don't seem to be able to be like really highly active in that stress response and also carry on executive functions. It's almost like that part of our brain just goes offline. So that's a really important part of our discussion around what it means to understand the impact of trauma. So just kind of put a pin on that. Another important piece is the middle part of this diagram, or the emotional state, which is happening in our limbic system. That in addition to managing things like our sensory input, our emotion responses, our memory, a lot of that is happening in that part of our brain. It's also really driven by our connectivity to other people and our emotional safety. So if you feel disrespected or unloved or disconnected from your group, that threat to your safety, because that's a threat to your safety, that's a threat to your survival, can be so strong that it will activate your stress response or the brainstem. So that's really important because sometimes that stress response, if we see it in other people or we see it in ourselves, seems out of context. It doesn't seem to always fit the situation that's going on. What's happening in the brain is that our brain has interpreted that this situation is so dangerous that my survival is at risk, and I need to fight, flight, or freeze, whatever is going to be most likely to keep me alive. So if someone is in their stress response, they really don't have the capacity to think logically or behave in rational ways. We don't really have like morals that influence our decision making because our decision making is not even really happening. Everything is very automated in order, again, to keep us alive. So when we talk about safety, there are actually lots of different dimensions of safety. And I don't have time today to unpack this in depth, but I did give you a handout in that packet that has some definitions of each of these. But what I want to highlight is that safety is not just a static state of being. It's defined differently for every person. And safety is impacted by many, many factors, including the environment, our interpersonal relationships, our internal responses, our past experiences. Any of those things can cause us to feel unsafe in the midst of whatever's going on. So understanding that safety is not just a foundational need for well-being, but it's also something that each of us can continually attend to for one another and for ourselves is really essential for becoming trauma-informed. These different elements or dimensions of safety, this is something my team has been working on for the last couple of years, and we've really we keep expanding it because we learn more, and I think that that's really exciting in terms of learning. But it can also be very sobering in terms of recognizing like how much our safety can be impacted in these different ways, in these different dimensions. So for example, just a really quick example, if your job is at risk in some way, that might be a sense, you may have a sense of financial unsafety. You may also have an influence on your occupational safety, like how are you going to fill your time? What meaning do you provide to your life, to the world? That can also start to filter into like your spiritual safety, that sense of like who you are and how you do contribute to something greater than yourself. There can also be influences on your social safety, certainly your emotional safety, because you've got this kind of uncertainty. That uncertainty is often interpreted as a threat in our limbic system. We like to know how things are going to go, right? And when we know how things are going to go, we feel pretty settled. We feel good. The moment something seems off, that starts to activate our brains, which means then our executive function can go offline. Now, I say all that to also say that our brains are very complex, and there are things you can do to increase your ability to get your brain back online or get your executive functions back online. A lot of that is through practices that are, we might call them mindfulness practices, anything that helps to bring you back to the present moment and helps you to settle your nervous system. Now, if you're actually in danger, you don't want to just be meditating while something really dangerous is going on around you. Maybe not the best idea. But hopefully those mindfulness practices would help you recognize that, and then you can get to safety. Okay, I think that's all I'm going to say about that for the moment, because I want to get into just defining trauma. What are we even talking about when we talk about trauma? And I did all that brain stuff first because it's important for defining what trauma is and how it plays out in our brains and bodies. So traumatic experiences, we usually think of as intense, overwhelming experiences. There's usually some serious loss or threat or harm to a person's physical or emotional well-being. Sometimes we attribute trauma to the event itself. And I want to tell you that trauma is not the event. There are lots and lots of potentially traumatic events, but the reality is not everybody who goes through all of those same events has the same experience and the same response. So it's not only about the event. It's a lot of times, when we dig a little deeper, it's more about our internal response to that perceived threat to our safety. And I say perceived because a real threat and a like might happen threat in our brains is basically the same thing. So even if we are worried or scared that something may happen, that in our brains don't always sort out that, oh, that maybe won't happen. We go right to catastrophe most of the time because we're trying to stay alive. That's the main thing. So that internal response is actually supposed to protect us from further harm. So that's really where trauma, the development of trauma happens, is because something has happened to us, something bad has happened to us. It was too much, it happened too soon, too fast. Our nervous system couldn't handle it, especially if we don't get resolution on it. And our nervous system wants to protect us from getting hurt again in the future. So we build up those responses that what we would maybe call traumatization. They can happen anytime in a person's life. So there are those events, those things, those experiences, and I'll unpack a few of those here in a moment. But really, the the important thing to remember with trauma is that it's an injury lodged in our nervous system. It's lodged in our mind and our body. We're stuck. We get stuck. And trauma really results from those internal and external resources that we have in varying degrees becoming overwhelmed by the threat. And that is where those individual differences often happen. So for example, I um I don't know, I'm going to highlight the snowstorm we had in Kansas City a few weeks ago. So that could be a potentially traumatic event. There was a lot of stuff that happened, lots of fear. If you had to drive somewhere, I work in a hospital system, so a lot of my colleagues had to still try to make it into work. I'm going to choose this kind of mild experience for this example, but if you have a lot of internal resources, like your sense of navigation, being able to problem solve or become resourceful, all of those kinds of internal things. And then you also have a lot of external resources available to you. Money, time off, supportive people in your life. That might mean if you've got both of those in high levels, that you're going to get through that experience and you're probably not going to feel like you're traumatized at the end of it. You're probably going to get through it okay. But if you don't have those experiences, I think about some of our community members who don't live in a building. They're living on the street or in a tent outside. That is a different kind of external resource that may not protect them as much from that storm. Then there are also internal factors that might play a role that would make that event potentially more impactful in the long term for them. And that's really an important piece of this definition of trauma too, is that the impacts of the traumatic event or the traumatic experience last long past that originating event. It can also be reactivated in us at any moment. We can have a reminder of what had happened before. It may not even be an explicit reminder. It may just be some sensory input that, like in our brain said, hey, that's just like when that bad thing happened before, and it can activate our stress response all over again. There are lots, as I said, lots of potentially traumatic experiences. I gave you this in the handout in a larger format, so hopefully you can make out the very tiny print a little bit better for that. Many of you are probably familiar already with ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. That happened in the 90s. It was kind of the first time that anyone in a broad report put together that the things that happen to you in childhood have a long-term health impact. Not only on mental health, which I think people often have expected. I worked in the mental health system in Kansas for quite a while. Most of my music therapy work was in the state hospital system. And when I first learned about trauma-informed care, I was like, oh yeah, of course. Like that makes sense. When you have bad things happen to you as a kid, you are more likely to develop mental health issues later in life. What I think really surprised people about that ACEs study was that they also saw an increase in risk of chronic conditions like cancer, COPD, hypertension, diabetes, like all of those increased generally, like across the population. So that ACEs study really opened up this idea that responding to the experiences that people had in our healthcare system is really important. Recognizing the impact that some of those have. If we, though, only limit ourselves to those ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, which are listed there in the tree on this graphic, there were only like 10, I think, in the very first study. There's a whole lot more than 10 things that can happen to us that are potentially traumatic. So if we put that together with the idea that there are all these other things and they can happen to us at any point in our life. Of course, childhood is a very key time for our development. But putting all that together, we understand that it's highly likely that every single person we've come in contact with has had something happen to them or will in the future. We just don't seem to get out of life without something potentially traumatic happening to us. Now, whether or not we actually experience trauma as a result of that is very individualized, because even though we have all of these different layers of trauma, including adverse community events. So, well, let me go back to the other slide. The things in the soil there, things that are really rooted even more deeply in what's listed as number 4 on this diagram, the atrocious cultural experiences. Rooted in those harmful social norms, segregation, colonization, and how that has really fed up into what's going on in our communities now in terms of poverty and access to resources, wages, air quality, water quality, those sorts of things. And then we also have the adverse climate events, the things that are going on both in terms of weather climate. I think, the fires in LA come to mind right now. This isn't the first time that California has had lots of wildfires, or out west they've had a lot of wildfires. Those are increasing. Things like our climate in the Midwest, that has really shifted. But then there's also climate events like the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, that impacted lots and lots and lots of people in many different ways. I would also add to this graphic, it's not on here, but I think our social and political climate is something that probably needs to make an appearance in a bolder way on this diagram, because that social and political climate that we're living in right now in the US, as well as in the world, is really impacting us. Where I feel pretty confident in predicting that we're going to see the impacts of what's going on now for years to come. So I think just remembering that all of those things are going on, they're all interrelated. There's layers and layers. Trauma is not only ACEs, it's many different types of experiences in life. And the other thing to keep in mind, though, is that ACEs are not destiny. Just because you had one of those, any of those ACEs or more, that doesn't mean that you're doomed. We all have the capacity for restoration, well-being, and growth. And noting that they are risk factors helps us identify pathways for healing, pathways for well-being. And it's important that we don't just leave that up to individuals to figure out for themselves. Humans are really driven by connection. And so being able to support that in one another is really essential and a foundational piece of trauma-informed practice. So sometimes we do get asked the question like, well, how do we know then? Like, we have all these potentially traumatic events. How do we know it's trauma? Well, we may not, to be honest, because every person's experience is unique. It may not be that valuable in the moment to try to label if it's traumatic. Listening to a person or seeing them, seeing their humanity, hearing what they've been through, reflecting that back, engaging, trying to learn more, being curious, staying out of judgment. That's way more important than trying to say like, oh, well, that's trauma. Unless you're diagnosing, which some of you might be, and you're engaging in a treatment plan around the trauma. Most of us, most of the time, don't need to be labeling for somebody else. I think that's up to each individual person to determine if what they experience is trauma. Now, that said, we can also live in denial a little bit too, right? So sometimes it can be helpful in some of those conversations. Probably not the first time you meet somebody though, but to help recognize the impact of stress on the brain, on the body. I do always also like to note that you don't have to know what somebody experienced in order to respond to them with compassion. And I will get to that a little bit more when I talk about like, what do we do? But for now, I just want to open up uh, a discussion on the chat. I see a couple of comments about the link to the slides. I'll check that. But just for a moment, either think to yourself, or if you're with someone else, you maybe share a little bit with each other, or you can type in the chat. How does this information, what I've just shared about what trauma is, how does that challenge your previous understanding of trauma? And let me see if I can just copy and paste that link. Okay, I put that link in the chat. You will let me know if that works better than typing it in. Okay, great. Thank you. It worked. Okay, so any comments on how this information challenges your understanding of trauma, or how you previously understood trauma? Okay, in the chat, that there are so many factors that can contribute and they're unique to each individual. Yeah, that was really eye-opening for me too, when I first kind of dug into this a little bit more. And I'll say a lot of the definition that I gave about trauma was from Resmaa Menakem, who I think is doing tremendous work in explaining, understanding, conveying that to people. Those definitions, that understanding that trauma is not the event, but it's really like what's going on, what's our response to it, was really helpful for me. It's also empowering. I feel it's empowering because it isn't just what happened, but it's also, what can I do to be responding to it for myself and for others too. Another comment, like the explanation of it as an injury. Yeah, and it is. I think, I have noted that our medical model in the United States, especially in Western medicine, has really divided out our mental health from our physical health, really separated it. And there is such an interconnectedness of what happens in our brains, in our nervous system, and then in our bodies, that we've really done ourselves a disservice, I think, in completely separating those so much. I know there's a lot of work now on integration, which I think is helpful, because it really is about whole health. I mean, our brain is part of our body, and the injuries we sustain emotionally and spiritually, all of those elements of safety have an impact on our physical health as well. And another comment about how the concepts that I presented here contextualize it, that cultural issues may be fundamental, how we understand the event, and then thus how it affects diverse people. Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, and another comment just about what I was saying about our brains and bodies, in integrating that together, how our diet impacts our mood. For instance, I know we just had a webinar a couple weeks ago on food and mood. So quick plug for that. Go back to the Metro Council YouTube channel if you want to watch that. But yeah, there's some really tremendous research coming out too around how what we eat influences our mood and our well-being, spiritually and emotionally and such, mentally, and not only physically. All right, I'm going to move on from here because I got a lot more to cover. I want to get to the what do we do stuff. But I do want to highlight just really briefly the impact of trauma. And I gave you a handout that really outlines a whole lot more of this. But when we have an experience of trauma and we're dealing with the effects of toxic stress, which I think we all are, it's part of our culture, unfortunately. The world really feels ominous, chaotic, and ultimately unsafe, which might mean that we just continue to loop in our stress response. It can be very hard to break out of that because of the toxic stress that we are exposed to on a daily, hourly, minute-to-minute basis. And so what happens then when we get stuck in that loop is that we become hypervigilant and reactive in a way that has some consequences for us, both in the immediate and also long term. And those consequences range from uh, our cognitive abilities. So all those executive functions that I talked about before, if we lose access to those, that can have some really deep impacts on our ability to do our jobs or engage positively with our community or our family. Um, there are impacts on our physical health, as I've mentioned, our education, our neurophysiological development and maturation, the way we make neural connections and learn. Also, our social and psychological health is impacted by trauma. So those impacts are pervasive and can really make it difficult to navigate the next thing that might happen. And that I think is a reality for a lot of people, that it's not just that we have one bad thing that happens to us. It can be event after event after event that can really build up for us and deepen those impacts. Wish I had more time to talk about that, but don't today. I do also want to highlight this idea of reactivation. So one of the impacts of trauma is that we can be reactivated by exposure to something that reminds us of that previous event. We used to call that triggers. My team has chosen to move away from that, and I just referenced that on this slide for today. For a couple of reasons. The word triggers can be a little triggering itself. There are some connotations associated with it. I personally don't like the connection to firearms with that. Like, that's what comes to mind for me. And also, I don't think it's the best description of what's happening in our brains when we have this experience. I like reactivation because it gives us that sense that this happened before, and because of this reminder, it's happening again. So we have a very, very similar stress response every time we have that that reactivation or that reminder of that previous event. That reminder can happen to us in lots of ways. The sensory system is quite complex. And so we have like kind of our 5 basic senses: sight, sound, smell, touch, taste. But we also have internal senses like our balance, our body awareness, interoception, which is like pain, and even our sense of emotions, because emotions we feel in our senses, not in our brains exactly, not in our minds. Emotions are physical responses also. Those oops, I didn't get that one up there. Sorry about that. Those activators sometimes are known for us. Like, we know that if I encounter, this phrase or this experience or this smell, we know that that's going to probably activate our stress response. But a lot of times we don't know, and other people around us don't know what might activate that. So just be aware that you may unintentionally activate a traumatic memory, or you might find yourself experiencing reactivation, and you don't always know how you're going to react to those. Usually it's activation of the stress response. So you may see some of those fight, flight, or freeze kinds of behaviors. The other thing about these activators or triggers is that they are influenced by our bias. So bias is very extensive. Bias happens because our brains need to take shortcuts because we are taking in so much information at once. I think I read somewhere that we have, I don't know, 1 billion pieces of information a minute or something into our brains. That's too much to sort through. So we have to take shortcuts, and sometimes in those shortcuts that bias develops and can make it so that things that maybe aren't that big a deal to us end up being a big deal to us. And so just having some self-awareness around that is an important piece of managing those activators. So I want you to just pause for a moment, because are running short on time, so just think on this for a minute. How do you see the impact of trauma and stress in those around you and in yourself? All right. So then I want to move into these other three pieces of what it means to be trauma informed very briefly, because again, I could talk about this for a very long time. But I think these other three are again very empowering because it gives us that, like, what do we do about it? So infusing knowledge, actively resist re-traumatization, and promote restoration, well-being, and growth. And we start to do that through the principles of trauma-informed care. Now, my team has selected to use the Missouri model principles of trauma-informed care. We love these definitions, and you've got them in your handout because they do underscore the impact of historical and systemic trauma and how that influences our ability to feel safe and like we can trust people, and our ability to have choice and voice, and our ability, or our maybe other people's willingness to collaborate with us, and also that sense of empowerment. So I encourage you to take a deeper look at those. The definitions I think are quite useful, but they are complex, so they take a little time to kind of read and digest. I want to move into some commitments and actions. So knowing what we know about trauma, about the impacts, what do we do? How do we respond to people who may be having a traumatic experience or have one in their past? And the first commitment is understanding that all behavior has meaning. I'm going to break each one of these down with an action step, so we'll get to those. The second commitment is resisting judgment. The third one is valuing lived experience as expertise. And then the fourth one is protecting relationships. So let me go into just a little more depth on these. The first one, understanding that all behavior has meaning. The action here is that we consider underlying needs and honor cultural differences. We all have needs that drive our behavior. Sometimes it's the need for safety. Sometimes it's the need for connection. Those are two of the most important needs we have. Is, do I feel safe? Do I feel like I can trust the people I'm with? Do I feel like I belong? That, I mean, probably drives, I don't know, I'm going to guess, it probably drives 80% of our behavior most of the time. There are other underlying needs, though, like maybe we're hungry or we're cold, or, you know, those physical kinds of needs. But sometimes what happens is the behavior, because of that traumatic experience in the past, is out of context with what's going on right now, because that traumatic experience has been reactivated. So what is going on now doesn't seem to fit to other people. So if we take a moment to just step back and stay out of judgment and be able to really think about, like, okay, what's really going on here? We may be able to uncover how that communication is happening to us. So if we think of it as the person is communicating something to us through their behavior versus they're just being a bad person, or they're trying to get on my nerves, that's usually not helpful. The second commitment is resisting judgment. And I know some of you are probably already familiar with this changing the question action item, which is changing the question from what's wrong with you. So when we see that behavior that's out of context, kind of our immediate response can be, what is wrong with them? Why are they doing that? But instead, resisting that judgment and stepping back and saying, I wonder what happened. I think we can even take that a step further. And I've been reading some things lately using language like what's strong with you or what matters. I think that what matters question is, and we don't have to ask these out loud, but just having that perspective, what matters to this person? That can help us understand maybe what the need is that's driving the behavior. In fact, that can be really powerful. I mentioned social and political climate earlier. If you're having a real clash of values or understanding with other people because of that social and political climate, step back for a minute and ask yourself, like, what matters to them? Why are they fighting so hard for this thing, whatever that disagreement's over? And, you may still not agree with them or with their behavior, but having a little bit more understanding of where that's coming from can help you see them as a human being again, and maybe hopefully can open up conversation so that maybe you can come to some shared understanding. I think when we approach people with the idea that I want to hear you, I want to understand you, we do tend to get a better response. The third commitment is valuing lived experience as expertise. So we really want to recognize that the way a person has survived is a strength. They have used those strengths to survive. It has been their solution to whatever need they have had that has been unmet. So again, trying to see things from the perspective of that person and building on their strengths. Sometimes that means we have to dig pretty deep to see the strength because of our own bias around how we understand what that behavior has been doing for the person. Sometimes this is for ourselves too. I think that's true for all of these. Sometimes we have to ask ourselves that question. I wonder what happened to me. What's going on? Pausing, taking a minute to check in can sometimes give us a lot of information about the reasons why we might be responding a certain way. And then finally, protecting relationships and really focusing in on creating a safe and collaborative culture, putting those principles of trauma-informed care into practice: safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment in all elements of our systems, actions, responses, really supporting that trauma-informed culture around us. And you can do that in any sphere of influence that you have, even if it's just you and your family, or you and your coworker, or maybe it's just you for you, whatever sphere of influence you have, creating that safe and collaborative, trusting culture, because we all have that innate need of belonging and connection. The other thing that's important about that is that healing happens in relationship. So prioritizing the relationships that contributes to well-being, creates an opportunity for us to have soothing of our stress response, calming our brains, being able to pull us into our executive functions so that we can have those really meaningful opportunities. So those are all the commitments and actions just on one slide for you. Sum that up. One of the terms that we often throw around a lot with trauma-informed caring is resilience. And trauma-informed caring really does foster resilience and well-being. And resilience is the capacity to develop, seek, and use healthy skills that help us to prepare for, cope with, and grow through adversity in a way that honors and strengthens an individual's mind, body, and spirit. So we sometimes say supporting resilience is an intervention, and it is also an outcome. It encompasses both the capacity to navigate our way to whatever resources we need, and also the capacity to request those or expect those, really, I think, in a culturally responsive way, that we honor the person's what matters. We honor what matters to them. And we do that for ourselves too. And that means sometimes we have disagreements, and that's okay. Being trauma-informed is not about letting people get away with bad stuff, bad behavior. It's not about just trying to, downplay any conflict. It's really about hearing somebody, trying to understand their perspective, working toward restoration. So just a few tips around working with those who've experienced trauma. Just be aware that something has probably happened. If they are showing a behavior that doesn't seem to fit with the context, or is maybe a stress response, if they seem elevated in that stress response, something has happened. Again, you don't necessarily have to know what it is, but if you can know what it is, sometimes that does help us be able to work toward resolution. Also be aware of those possible activators. Think comfort and not control. I think one of the things that happens when we get stressed, when we see somebody who is in their stress response and we get stressed as a result, which is totally normal because that's catching, we want to try to control it. And actually, we don't think about that. We just do it. Control is sort of a natural response to something that is unsettled. So again, practicing that ability to calm yourself, to recenter yourself so that you can provide comfort and not have to try to fix the situation, because helpers can be activating sometimes as well. We also want to model and promote stress management techniques through engaging in those calm and curious and relational conversations, and then practicing mindfulness, as I've mentioned, especially when you become activated. doing those things that are what I would call trauma-informed self-care. So noting your own reactions and responses, observing the patterns, staying out of judgment, and meeting your needs in a healthy way, both for yourself and for those around you. So that supports resisting re-traumatization in yourself and others, also increases our capacity to promote restoration, well-being, and growth. And just a few tips for that trauma-informed self-care, using some grounding strategies. I've given you a handout around that. Sometimes we can't just leave the situation. We might be responsible for the person who's having the trauma response. We may need to do something to get ourselves back online so that we can help. So having some of those ready to use rapid resets. My tip for that is practice them before you get into those stressful moments. So have a regular routine of guiding yourself through a mindful rapid reset, whether that's breathing, doing something like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, where you just name in your mind 5 things you can see, 4 you can touch, 3 you can hear, 2 you can smell, 1 you can taste. Anything that works for you, you kind of have to play around with things sometimes and find out what helps your nervous system. I think, again, we're all individuals, so we all respond to those things in different ways, but find what works for you. Do it a bunch when you're not stressed so that your brain already knows how to do it when you get into those stressful situations, because it's going to be hard for you to retrieve that in a really thoughtful, cognitive way. It's got to be a little more automated. The other tip I'll give you is completing the stress response cycle. This has been life-changing for me personally. The idea that when you're managing the day's stressors, your body is managing the day's stress, and the stress is going to do some damage to you if you don't do something to complete the stress response cycle. So this comes from the book Burnout by Emily and Amelia Nagoski, which I highly recommend. So they say it's absolutely essential to your well-being that you give your body the resources it needs to complete the stress cycles that have been activated. And I gave you a handout on how to do that. So some suggestions include especially movement, because there's something about physically metabolizing the stress chemicals in your body that help you achieve a more settled state. It may not totally get rid of the stressor, right? Those stressors might continue on for a long time. But if you do something to just take care of your body and your mind, manage that stress impact, it actually will give you more capacity to deal with the stressor. So have a regular practice every, end of the day, at the end of a difficult encounter with somebody else, bigger practices at the end of the week, maybe, or on a regular basis where you especially like create something or engage in a positive social interaction. Lots of suggestions there. I really want to encourage you to consider how to do that. A few other just resources that my team has put together on our virtual room of refuge, which you can access at that link, bit.ly/community room of refuge, or you can use the QR code. We update that fairly regularly, and there are some varied resources for building resilience there. Please share that too. That's just open. We launched that toward the beginning of the pandemic, and we've had, I think, around 12,000 visits to that since that time. So we're pretty excited about sharing those resources that we found. There's a few that we made, but it's mostly stuff we found and reshared. And if you have suggestions for that, feel free to reach out to me and give me those suggestions. I'll see if we can work them in. We don't have a ton of time for questions and discussions today, but I do want you to think about, and you can put this in the chat too if you'd like, what is one thing you could do differently or pay more attention to after hearing what I've shared with you today? And while you're thinking about that, if you didn't get the QR for the slides before, it is there on the screen. And also, if you want to learn more from my team, we are in the process of launching a new on-demand learning platform on Thinkific. So you can go to ctii.thinkific.com. We also have live events. We have our 2-day deep dive training into trauma-informed care on February 5th and 6th, and we still have a few seats available. So you can get to that at bit.ly/CTII-events. You can also check out the podcast I mentioned, Trauma Informed Caring. You can find that on Spotify. We're in the process of moving our old seasons over there to that Trauma Informed Caring platform. And of course, you can email me if you have questions. All right. And thank you, those of you who put your things you can do differently in the chat. I encourage you to take that idea, maybe share it with one other person in your life. Who else can help support you in becoming more trauma informed? I
So
didn't leave any time for questions, Jamie. I'm so sorry.
that is okay. Andrea, I just want to thank you so much, so very much for presenting today. This was incredible. And I had no idea about the burnout book. I thought that was that was a new one for me. So thank you all so much for attending. I did put the certificate of attendance in the chat. So if anybody needs that, they're welcome to. Andrea, I'm going to stick around for a couple more minutes. Andrea, if you'd like to stick around for a couple more minutes in case anybody has questions, that is great. And hopefully we'll see you at our next webinar in February. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day. So if anybody has any questions, they can put it into the chat. Okay. Seeing none, I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you all.
Thank you.